anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And it also provided there would be subsequent conferences to come up with specifics on how to achieve that objective. The most important of these forums, these conventions, was held in Kyoto in 1997, and it led to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol set forth a procedure where we would start with the global levels of emissions that existed in 1990, and then by the period 2008 through 2012, we would try to get to 5% below that. So the first horizontal line that you see here is what were the 1990 levels of emissions, and the blue line below that is 5% below that. As you can see, we blew straight through that. Had the objectives of the Kyoto Protocol been achieved, we'd be down to that lower number. We're nowhere near that. The emissions growth that we have seen since then is overwhelmingly in China. The emissions from the US and Europe have, to a certain extent, leveled off and are beginning to decline. But in China and secondarily in India and Brazil and some of the other rapidly developing countries, it has continued at a very high pace. So in 2009, the countries of the world got together in Copenhagen in an effort to come up with a successor agreement to Kyoto that would move that line down, would involve the rapidly developing countries in addition to the already developed countries, and hopefully come up with a new global binding agreement. That failed. It did not happen. 2 years later, at the UN Climate Conference in Durban, an agreement was reached that included what I believe is probably the saddest sentence in all of international environmental law. It was basically a declaration in 2011 that we'll try to come up with a new agreement in 2015 that will begin implementing in 2020. In other words, we've lost more than a decade in coming forward with an agreement. Now, I regret to say, and it'll be no surprise to any of you, that we are nowhere near achieving a climate legislation in the United States. And let me just spend a couple of minutes on that. For many years, environmental legislation was a matter of bipartisan consensus in this country. The Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970 virtually unanimously. It was strengthened in 1977, again by lopsided votes, very strong Republican support as well as Democratic support in both the House and the Senate. Again in 1990, the Clean Air Act was strengthened, again with very strong bipartisan support. 1990 is the last year that the United States Congress has passed a major new environmental statute. It had the Clean Air Act amendments and also the Oil Pollution Act. Since then, there haven't been any major new environmental statutes here, so I have to tell my students when I teach environmental law that I am telling you about statutes that were passed before most of you were born.